Afghanistan, located at the crossroads of Central and South Asia, has a rich and complex history that spans millennia. Its strategic location has made it a center of diverse cultures, empires, and civilizations. The history of Afghanistan is marked by its role as a melting pot of various ethnic groups, including Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and many others, contributing to a rich cultural heritage. The history of Afghanistan can be traced back to ancient times, with a region known as Iran in the early Persian Empire. It was a part of the ancient Persian Empire, and later, the area was influenced by the Greeks after Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century BCE. Following Alexander's death, the region was ruled by the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, a Hellenistic state that fostered a blend of Greek and local traditions, creating the foundation for the region's cultural and political landscape. During the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the region fell under the rule of the Kushan Empire, which played a key role in promoting trade along the Silk Road and the spread of Buddhism. The Kushans were succeeded by a number of smaller kingdoms until the rise of the Sassanid Empire in Persia in the 3rd century CE, which also exerted influence over the region. In the 7th century CE, the spread of Islam transformed Afghanistan, as it became a part of the Islamic Caliphate. This period marked the start of a new era in Afghanistan's history, as the region saw a blend of Islamic and local traditions, with major contributions to Islamic culture and learning. The Abbasid Caliphate took control of Afghanistan during this time, and cities like Herat, Kabul, and Kandahar flourished as centers of culture and scholarship. The region saw frequent invasions and the rise and fall of various empires, including the Ghaznavid and Ghurid dynasties, which consolidated power in the 11th and 12th centuries. In the 13th century, Afghanistan was devastated by the Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan, which caused widespread destruction but also left an indelible mark on the region's demographics and culture. In the 15th century, the Timurid Empire, founded by Tamerlane Timur, brought a period of stability and prosperity to Afghanistan. Herat became a major cultural center during the Timurid era, fostering advancements in art, architecture, and science. However, by the 16th century, the region fell under the control of the Safavid Empire in Persia, while part of Afghanistan came under the rule of the Mughal Empire from India. The 18th century saw the rise of the Durrani Empire, considered the foundation of modern Afghanistan. Ahmed Shah Durrani, often referred to as a founder of Afghanistan, united various tribes and established the Durrani Empire in 1747. This period saw Afghanistan's emergence as a distinct political entity, though it faced constant threats from neighboring powers, including Persia, Britain, and Russia. The British Empire, in particular, had strategic interests in Afghanistan due to its proximity to British India, leading to the First Anglo-Afghan War in 1839 to 1842, a devastating defeat for the British. The Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, resulted in Afghanistan becoming a British protectorate, although it retained a degree of sovereignty. This period of British influence in Afghanistan was marked by political instability and resistance from Afghan leaders, including Shia Ali Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan. The border between Afghanistan and British India was drawn, known as the Durand Line, which remains a source of tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan. In the 20th century, Afghanistan experienced significant political upheaval. The country remained largely independent until 1919, when it achieved full sovereignty following the Third Anglo-Afghan War. The early 20th century saw modernization efforts under King Emmanuel Khan, who sought to reform Afghan society, particularly in terms of education, women's rights, and infrastructure. However, his reforms faced strong opposition from conservative factions, leading to his abdication in 1929. In the mid-20th century, Afghanistan experienced a series of coups and shifting alliances. In 1973, King Zahir Shah was overthrown in a coup, and a republic was established under the leadership of Daud Khan. However, in 1978, a communist coup led to the establishment of a Marxist government, which was supported by the Soviet Union. This period of communist rule was marked by widespread repression and resistance, particularly from Islamist groups. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a turning point in the country's history. The Soviet Union sought to prop up the communist government, but the invasion sparked a fierce resistance from Afghan guerrilla fighters, known as the Mujahideen, who were supported by the United States, Pakistan, and other countries. The Soviet forces faced heavy losses, and in 1989, they withdrew from Afghanistan, leaving the country in a state of civil war. In the years following the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan was embroiled in a brutal civil war between various factions of the Mujahideen. This power struggle eventually gave rise to the Taliban, an Islamist militant group that took control of Kabul in 1996. The Taliban established a strict interpretation of Sharia law, which led to widespread human rights abuses, particularly against women and ethnic minorities. During the Taliban's rule, Afghanistan became a haven for terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, carried out by Al-Qaeda, prompted the U.S. to launch an invasion of Afghanistan. The Taliban regime was quickly overthrown, and a new Afghan government was established under President Hamid Karzai. The U.S. and NATO forces remained in Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades, engaging in efforts to stabilize the country and combat insurgencies from the Taliban and other militant groups. However, the war in Afghanistan became increasingly complex, with ongoing conflict, corruption, and the rise of new militant groups like the Islamic State. In 2021, the U.S. and NATO forces began withdrawing from Afghanistan, leading to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the return of the Taliban to power. The Taliban's resurgence has led to widespread concern about the future of Afghanistan, particularly regarding human rights, security, and governance. Afghanistan's history is deeply intertwined with the global geopolitical landscape, as it has been a battleground for empires, ideologies, and global powers. The country's rich cultural heritage and complex political dynamics continue to shape its future as it seeks to navigate the challenges of rebuilding after decades of conflict and instability. The return of the Taliban to power in 2021 marked a significant chapter in Afghanistan's history. Following the U.S. military withdrawal, which was conducted under a peace agreement signed between the U.S. and the Taliban in 2020, the Taliban quickly regained control of much of the country. Kabul, the capital, fell to the Taliban in August 2021, forcing President Ashraf Ghani to flee the country. The swift collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's takeover led to widespread panic, chaos, and a humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of Afghans attempted to flee the country, seeking refuge abroad, particularly in the West, as they feared the return of harsh Taliban rule. The international community responded with mixed concern and calls for protection of human rights, especially for women and ethnic minorities, who face severe restrictions under Taliban rule. During their previous rule in the late 1990s, the Taliban had enforced a strict interpretation of Islamic law that severely limited women's rights, including prohibiting them from working, receiving education, and participating in public life. Their return to power prompted fears that these oppressive measures would be reinstated. Despite the Taliban's promises to moderate their stance and respect human rights, many reports from inside Afghanistan have indicated that they have maintained or even strengthened repressive policies. Women and girls face significant setbacks, with many secondary schools for girls closed, and restrictions placed on women's ability to travel or participate in the workforce. In addition, ethnic and religious minorities, including the Hazara Shiite community, have faced persecution and violence under the Taliban. The country's economic situation has also deteriorated dramatically since the Taliban's return. With the international community largely refusing to recognize the Taliban government, Afghanistan has faced a severe financial crisis. International aid, which was vital to the country's economy, was frozen, and many foreign countries have imposed sanctions on Afghanistan's leadership. Unemployment rates have skyrocketed, and the healthcare and education systems, which were already under strain, have collapsed further. The UN and various humanitarian organizations have worked to provide aid to the Afghan people, but the situation remains dire. Afghanistan has faced an economic collapse, with skyrocketing inflation, widespread poverty, and a severe shortage of basic goods, including food and medicine. The humanitarian crisis has been exacerbated by ongoing conflict, internal displacement, and the failure of the government to establish control over the entire country. While the Taliban has made attempts to establish some form of governance, including the re-establishment of law and order in some areas, Afghanistan remains a nation in turmoil. Meanwhile, security challenges have persisted. The Taliban's resurgence has not completely eliminated the threat of insurgent groups like ISIS-K, a faction of the Islamic State that operates within Afghanistan. ISIS-K has targeted Taliban fighters, ethnic minorities, and civilians in deadly attacks, adding to the uncertainty and instability in the country. The Taliban's struggle to assert full control over the country has made it difficult to maintain peace, and parts of Afghanistan remain affected by ongoing violence. On the international front, Afghanistan's future remains uncertain. The international community is divided over how to engage with the Taliban. While some countries, particularly in the region, have signaled a willingness to engage diplomatically with the Taliban, many Western countries remain skeptical and call for the Taliban to meet specific conditions related to human rights, the treatment of women, and counter-terrorism efforts. The fate of Afghanistan's vast mineral resources, which are considered a potential driver for the country's future development, also remains up in the air, as foreign investment and technological expertise are necessary for their extraction and management. Afghanistan's history continues to be defined by its people's resilience in the face of repeated adversity. Despite centuries of foreign invasions, internal strife, and political instability, the Afghan population has shown remarkable strength and perseverance. Whether through resisting foreign powers, enduring civil war, or navigating the challenges brought on by the Taliban's return, the Afghan people remain determined to shape their own future. The cultural heritage of Afghanistan is another aspect of the nation's ongoing legacy. While political instability has caused significant destruction in recent decades, including the demolition of the famous Buddhas of Bamiyan by the Taliban in 2001, Afghanistan's cultural diversity and historical significance remain strong. The country's art, literature, music, and architecture reflect centuries of rich cultural exchange between Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. These cultural treasures, both tangible and intangible, are a testament to Afghanistan's historical importance as a center of learning and civilization. As Afghanistan faces yet another period of transition, its future remains unclear. The country's people, its complex history, and its geopolitical significance all make it a key area of interest in global politics. How Afghanistan navigates its current crisis, how it addresses its internal divisions, the rise of militant groups, and the demands of the international community will shape its future in profound ways. The people of Afghanistan continue to hope for peace, security, and prosperity despite the many challenges that lie ahead. The road ahead for Afghanistan remains filled with significant challenges, particularly in terms of governance, security, and human rights. The Taliban's return to power has redefined the political landscape of the country, with a group seeking to establish its interpretation of Islamic law while navigating the demands of both its internal population and the international community. Afghanistan's internal divisions, including ethnic and regional tensions, remain a major factor in the nation's future. The Pashtun-majority Taliban has historically struggled to gain the trust of non-Pashtun ethnic groups like Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras, which could contribute to ongoing fragmentation and instability within the country. At the heart of Afghanistan's current challenges is the issue of human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls. After the Taliban took control in 2021, they imposed restrictions that reversed many of the advances made in the previous 2 decades, particularly regarding women's education and employment. The promise of inclusivity and tolerance from the Taliban has largely proven hollow, with widespread reports of human rights abuses, including the repression of women's voices, freedom of expression, and suppression of civil society groups. Women in Afghanistan are again largely excluded from public life, and girls are still prohibited from attending secondary schools in many areas, despite international pressure for change. The economic crisis in Afghanistan remains severe, with many people facing extreme poverty. The absence of foreign investment, lack of banking infrastructure, and the suspension of aid has crippled the country's economy, which has historically been dependent on foreign assistance. With international sanctions in place and the Taliban struggling to maintain control over the entire country, the Afghan economy has spiraled into disarray. Inflation has skyrocketed, with everyday goods and food becoming increasingly unaffordable for the average Afghan citizen. This situation has led to widespread hunger, malnutrition, and a growing refugee crisis, as millions of Afghans seek asylum in neighboring countries or further abroad. The failure of the international community to provide meaningful support to the Afghan government after the U.S. withdrawal has resulted in an ongoing humanitarian disaster. While international aid organizations have been working to provide food and medical assistance, much of the necessary infrastructure to sustain long-term recovery is missing. The government's lack of legitimacy in the eyes of much of the international community has made it difficult for the Taliban to access the funds and resources needed to address the country's dire economic and social conditions. Security remains another critical issue, with the rise of insurgent groups like ISIS-K complicating efforts to stabilize Afghanistan. Though the Taliban officially controls most of the country, it continues to face challenges in curbing the influence of ISIS-K and other extremist factions. ISIS-K has carried out numerous bombings, particularly targeting the Shiite Hazara minority, as well as Taliban forces. The ongoing violence threatens to further destabilize the already fragile nation. The inability of the Taliban to provide security to all Afghan citizens has fueled further frustration, leaving many Afghans with little choice but to seek safety elsewhere. Additionally, Afghanistan faces a challenge of restoring its international relationships. The country remains largely isolated on the world stage, with only a few countries, such as Pakistan, Russia, and China, showing some level of diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. The West, particularly the United States and European Union, has been slow to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan, primarily due to the group's history of human rights violations, its ties to terrorism, and its repressive policies. Some countries have called for conditional engagement, urging the Taliban to meet specific human rights standards, particularly regarding women's rights and freedom of expression. The international community's hesitation to fully recognize the Taliban has contributed to the country's economic crisis and isolation. The question of what the future holds for Afghanistan is deeply tied to these unresolved issues. If the Taliban cannot deliver on promises of governance, security, and human rights, the country risks further fragmentation and potential escalation of internal conflicts. Afghanistan's relationship with its neighbors is another critical factor, as its geopolitical position will continue to attract regional powers' interests. Pakistan, Iran, and Central Asian republics all have vital stakes in Afghanistan's stability, with cross-border ethnic ties, trade routes, and security concerns that cannot be ignored. The relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, in particular, is particularly complicated due to the historical issues surrounding the Durand Line border and the presence of the Pashtun diaspora in both countries. As Afghanistan's people struggle to find a way forward, the cultural and historical importance of the country remains undiminished. Despite the challenges faced by its people, Afghanistan's heritage continues to stand as a testament to the enduring spirit of its civilization. The country's role as a crossroads of various cultures, religions, and civilizations remains a defining characteristic of its identity. From the ancient cities of Herat and Balkh, which once flourished as centers of trade, learning, and cultural exchange, to the modern-day resilience of its citizens, Afghanistan's history is a story of enduring strength and perseverance. As the international community watches Afghanistan's development with a mix of caution and concern, the future of the country will depend on the ability of its people and leaders to overcome decades of war and instability. The Afghan population, deeply rooted in their culture and history, has shown resilience in the face of foreign invasions, civil war, and internal conflict. Whether the country can overcome its current crisis and rebuild its institutions remains an open question. Ultimately, Afghanistan's history will continue to be shaped by its people's determination to define their own future in the face of overwhelming challenges. The hope for peace, stability, and prosperity remains alive in the hearts of many Afghans, despite the difficulties they face today. Their resilience, alongside the ongoing global efforts to support and engage with the country, will determine the path forward for Afghanistan in the years to come.